For 12 years, a woman lived with a sickness no one could cure. The Bible never tells us her name. It does not tell us where she came from, how old she was, or what her life had been like before she became sick. It simply tells us that she had been bleeding for 12 years. And by the time she heard about Jesus, she had almost nothing left. She had gone from doctor to doctor. She had endured treatment after treatment. She had spent everything she had trying to become well. But nothing had worked. In fact, the Gospel of Mark tells us that instead of getting better, she had become worse. For 12 years. Think about how long that really is. 4,000 days of waking up with the same problem. Month after month. Year after year. At first, perhaps she thought it would pass. Maybe she told herself that she only needed to wait a little longer. Maybe the next physician would understand. Maybe the next treatment would work. Maybe next month would be different. But the months became years. 1 year passed. Then another. Then another. And eventually, hope must have become difficult. But her suffering was not only physical. To understand what this woman was carrying, you have to understand the world in which she lived. According to the Jewish purity laws described in the Law of Moses, ongoing bleeding made a person ceremonially unclean. This did not mean she was sinful simply because she was sick, but it did mean that her condition affected her religious and social life. Her sickness followed her everywhere. She could not simply pretend it did not exist. Imagine living like that for 12 years. Watching life continue around you while your own life seems trapped in the same painful place. Watching other people move forward. Watching families celebrate. Watching ordinary days come and go. While you keep asking the same question, when will this end? And then one day, she heard about a man named Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. By this time, people throughout the region were talking about him. They said he taught with an authority people had never heard before. They said he had driven out demons. They said he had healed the sick. They said he had even touched people others were afraid to touch. And now, Jesus was nearby. But he was not alone. A large crowd surrounded him. People pressed against him from every side. And Jesus was already going somewhere important. A synagogue leader named Jairus had come looking for him. Jairus' young daughter was dying. He had fallen at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his home. Jesus agreed. So Jesus began walking with Jairus, and the crowd followed. Somewhere in that crowd was the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had heard about Jesus, and a thought had taken hold of her heart. If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. She did not ask for Jesus to come to her house. She did not expect him to stop everything and speak to her. Perhaps she did not even believe she deserved to ask. She simply believed that if she could get close enough, if she could reach through that crowd, if her hand could touch even his garment, Jesus could do what 12 years of searching had failed to do. So she went toward him. Imagine the crowd. People shoulder to shoulder. Everyone trying to get closer. Everyone moving with Jesus. Voices everywhere. Dust rising beneath their feet. Jairus desperately wanting Jesus to hurry because his daughter was dying. The disciples trying to stay near their teacher. And somewhere behind them, a weak, suffering woman trying to make her way through. Perhaps someone pushed past her. Perhaps she nearly lost sight of Jesus. Perhaps fear told her to turn around. What if someone recognized her? What if they knew about her condition? What if they told her to leave? What if she reached Jesus and nothing happened? That may have been the most frightening possibility of all, because she had hoped before. She had trusted treatments before. She had spent money before. She had probably heard promises before. And every time, she remained sick, but she kept moving. Closer. One step, then another, until finally, Jesus was within reach. She stretched out her hand. Her fingers touched his garment, and immediately, something happened. The bleeding stopped. Not gradually, not days later. Immediately. The Bible says she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. After 12 years, it was over. The condition that had followed her everywhere stopped. The sickness that had taken her money stopped. The suffering physicians had been unable to cure stopped. For the first time in 12 years, her body was different. Imagine her standing there in the crowd. Perhaps she could barely believe it. She had touched his clothing. That was all. One touch. And she knew. She was healed. Maybe she thought she could quietly disappear. Jesus was busy. Jairus was waiting. The crowd was moving. No one needed to know. She had received what she came for. She could go home. But then, Jesus stopped. The entire movement of the story suddenly changed. Jesus turned around. And he asked, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples could hardly understand the question. People were everywhere. The crowd was pressing against Jesus from every side. People had been touching him constantly. Yet Jesus was asking, "Who touched me?" His disciples pointed out the obvious. There was a crowd around him. How could he ask who touched him? But Jesus knew something had happened. He knew that power had gone out from him. And he began looking around. The woman realized she could not remain hidden. Think about what she must have felt. A moment earlier, she had experienced the greatest miracle of her life. Now Jesus had stopped. He was looking for her. The crowd was watching. The woman became afraid. Mark tells us that she came trembling. She fell before Jesus, and she told him the whole truth. Perhaps for years she had tried to hide her condition. Now she was telling her story in front of Jesus. 12 years of suffering. The doctors. The money. The disappointment. The desperation. And finally, the touch. Everyone was waiting to hear what Jesus would say. Would he be angry? Would he rebuke her for touching him? Would he remind everyone that she had been considered ceremonially unclean? Jesus looked at her, and the first word recorded from his mouth to this woman was not a condemnation. It was not a warning. It was not a rebuke. He called her, "Daughter, daughter." We do not know her name, but we know what Jesus called her. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." For 12 years, her life had been associated with one condition. People may have known her by what was wrong with her. She may even have begun to see herself that way. The sick woman, the unclean woman, the woman who could not be healed. But Jesus did not name her by her suffering. He called her daughter. And there is something even more remarkable about that moment. Jesus was on his way to help someone else. Jairus' daughter was dying. Every second must have felt precious to that desperate father. Yet Jesus stopped for this woman. She had not shouted his name. She had not asked the crowd to move. She had not demanded his attention. She had tried to receive her healing unnoticed. But Jesus would not allow her to leave believing she had simply stolen a miracle from him. He wanted her to know that he had seen her. Her healing was not an accident. She mattered. The woman who had spent 12 years feeling separated from ordinary life stood before Jesus, and he publicly called her daughter. There were many people touching Jesus that day. The crowd was pressing against him. But this woman reached for him believing that he could save her from what no one else had been able to cure. And Jesus noticed. That is why this story has been remembered for nearly 2,000 years. Not because we know the woman's name. We do not. Not because she was wealthy. She had spent what she had. Not because she was powerful. She approached Jesus trembling. Her story was remembered because a suffering woman reached for Jesus, and Jesus did not turn her away. Maybe that is why this story still speaks so deeply to people today. Because 12 years can take many forms. For her, it was bleeding. For someone else, it may be grief that has never completely disappeared. For another person, it may be loneliness, a family that has been broken, a prayer that seems unanswered, a burden carried so long that you can barely remember what life felt like before it began. There are struggles that last so long that eventually you stop telling people about them. At first, everyone knows. Everyone asks how you are doing. Everyone tells you they are praying. Then time passes. People continue with their lives. And somehow, you are still carrying it. That is when the heart can begin asking dangerous questions. Has God forgotten me? Does Jesus see me? Do I still matter? Remember this woman. 12 years had passed. Jesus still saw her. She was hidden among hundreds of people. Jesus still noticed her. She approached him afraid. Jesus did not reject her. She carried a condition that had made her ceremonially unclean. Jesus called her daughter. Her suffering had lasted a long time. But the length of her suffering did not determine the limits of Christ's compassion. And notice something else. Jesus did not promise that everyone who touches a piece of clothing will receive whatever miracle they ask for. The garment was not magic. The story is about Jesus. The woman believed that the power she needed was found in him. So she reached for him. That is where her hope was. Not in herself, not in another physician, not in another treatment, not in the garment itself, in Jesus. And Jesus responded to her faith. Maybe you are listening to this story while carrying something nobody around you completely understands. Maybe you have prayed about it many times. Maybe you have wondered why God has allowed it to continue. This story does not tell us that every suffering will end immediately. It does not tell us that faithful people will never experience long seasons of pain. This woman herself had suffered for 12 years before that day came. But it does show us something about Jesus. He is not indifferent to suffering. He is not too busy for the person hidden in the crowd. And he does not measure your worth by what has happened to you. The woman entered that crowd carrying 12 years of pain. She left hearing one word that must have reached deeper than her physical healing. Daughter. Imagine walking home after that. The same streets, the same town, the same people, but everything had changed. That morning, she had awakened as a woman still carrying a 12-year illness. By the end of the day, she had stood face to face with Jesus. She had heard his voice. She had received his peace, and she had been healed. Maybe she looked at her hands differently after that day, especially the hand that had reached through the crowd. Because sometimes faith does not look dramatic. Sometimes faith is simply refusing to stop reaching for Jesus, even after disappointment, even after waiting, even when the crowd is in the way, even when you feel unworthy, even when you are afraid. She reached, and Jesus stopped. So if you ever feel invisible, remember the woman in the crowd. If you ever believe your suffering has lasted too long for God to care, remember the 12 years. If you ever think your past makes you too unclean to approach Jesus, remember what he called her. Daughter. The crowd saw one suffering woman. Jesus saw someone worth stopping for. The world may have known her by her condition. Jesus gave her peace. And although the Bible never tells us her name, her story still tells us who Jesus is. The one who notices the forgotten. The one who sees the suffering hidden in the crowd. The one who does not turn away from those who reach for him. For 12 years, she had searched for healing. Then one day, she heard that Jesus was near. She pushed through the crowd. She stretched out her hand. She touched his garment, and Jesus stopped for her.